for this meeting of the Financial Resources Scrutiny Forum held on 9 February 2023. So I can see that we have present Councillor Matthew Buchanan, Councillor Dewar, Councillor Ferguson. Do we have Councillor Gowland? We do have Councillor Gowland. Do we have Councillor Keat? No Councillor Keat. Do we have Councillor Lockhart? No. I can see that we also have present Councillor Marsh. We have apologies from Councillor McAdams, and Councillor Nugent is also present. Councillor Kerr, I can see that you are present in the meeting. Can you let me know who you are substituting for?
Hi there. Yeah, Councillor McAdams.
Thank you, that's lovely.
Thanks.
Thank you, Carol. We will move on to the first item of business, and that's declaration of interests. No declaration of interests. We'll move on. Item number 2, minutes of the previous meeting. And those are on pages 3 to 6. Can we agree the minutes of the previous meeting, please?
Agreed, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Mars. Moving on. Item number 3A. Capital Budget Monitoring 2022 to 2023. General Fund Capital Programme. Those are on pages 7 to 28. Jackie Taylor will take us through the report, along as Head of Finance and Strategy. Derek Craig, Property Manager, Commercial.
Thank you, Chair. So this is our capital programme for General Fund, and this covers the period to the 29th of December 2022. I take you to section 4. This covers that we have a General Fund budget of £78.3 million for the year. That includes some adjustments to the programme which are detailed in the appendix, which I'll cover in a second, and they were approved at the Executive Committee on the 1st of February. Now, these adjustments total £531,000 and include additional funding for new projects, but due to the timing of project spend, it's anticipated that that funding will slip into the next financial year. Therefore, the net impact this year is nil. There's a change to the funding package which is shown at the top of page 8 around the general capital grant, and that's detailed there for your information. So 202,000 extra was received. Section 4.6 talks about our outturn position, our outturn exercise that we've carried out this year, and we'll cover this as well when we move on to our revenue paper. This is the time of the year where we look to predict spend position for the end of the financial year. Our estimates suggest that at the moment we expect an outturn spend of £73 million for this year. So that means a net underspend on our budget of £5.3 million. The majority of that variance is simply due to timing of spend. We'll carry forward any unspent budgets into the new financial year, and those projects will incur that spend in that year. A list of the main projects with anticipated underspends are included for your information at Appendix E. At section 4.11, the period 10 position is stated, so that's the position to the 29th of December. And we're showing that spend totals £37.2 million at that point in time. So we're slightly ahead of where we expect to be, and again, that just reflects timing of spend on projects. If I take you to the appendices, on page 10, we have Appendix A. Now this details the adjustments to the programme that I mentioned earlier, and as you can see, they reflect additional funding that we've received in, and that money being moved into the new financial year when the spend will be made. Appendix B on page 11 gives a summary of our overall capital programme with budget against each resource at the bottom table. Moving on to Appendix C on page 12, we have further breakdown of information across resources and services, showing the annual budget for capital and the actual spend on the right-hand column for your information. Appendix D covers the funding for the capital programme, and as I've reported before, the majority of the funding for our capital programme is from borrowing and from capital grant that we received from the Scottish Government. And you can see on the right-hand side there that we've received £60.7 million of funding already this year. Appendix E is the appendix I referred to in the report, which shows the projects where spend will be made into the new financial year. And you can see the expected completion dates on that table as well. And the funding for these projects will carry forward from this financial year. When we move to Appendix F on page 16, this starts to cover the physical progress on projects, and I'll hand over to Derek Craig. Thanks.
So page 16, the report shows that we are not behind in any projects at this period. Over the page onto the non-build executive summary, we are showing 8 projects behind programme, and jumping to page 19, there's a list there of each with an explanation for those, so I'll run through each one of those. Library IT infrastructure upgrade costs, projects behind as a result of the works on phase 2, the desktop refresh, being programmed for completion during summer 2023. The next one is extension of the cemeteries, Phillips Hill Cemetery. It's projects behind as a result of additional conditions of the planning consent that a flood risk assessment and drainage strategy needs to be in place before we can go out to tender, and awaiting on-site meeting with flood prevention team in order to carry that out. Springhall Urban Green Space is the next project. The Springhall Community Group have been asked to consider options for this project, given the equipment requested is likely to cost more than originally anticipated. The next one is Halfway Park Play Area. The project is behind schedule due to the long lead-in times for play equipment deliveries. The next project is the allotments at Chattel Row. This is behind schedule as a result of a delay in receiving planning consent for the proposed new allotments. But planning consent has now been received. Tender documentation has now been forwarded to our procurement colleagues and ready for publication. The next project is a city deal project, the community growth area Lanark Road signalisation. Now this project's behind due to the original tendering contractors all withdrawing from the tender process, so this project needs to be re-tendered. The next project is Vacant and Derelict Land Fund, the Clyde Gateway project at Gunniger Loop. This project is behind schedule due to the delays experienced by Clyde Gateway Urban Regeneration Company to complete the road. The last project is Digital Tools, and this project is behind schedule due to the increased lead-in times for equipment. Moving on to the next page, page 20, is the roads executive summary, and there's a report there of one item being behind the programme. And page 21 tells us that it's a city deal, Glasgow City Deal Region project at Cathkin Relief Road, and this is the claims part of the Relief Road. So we are awaiting outstanding information from the claims company in order for the claims to be processed here. That's all for.
Are there any further questions on item 3A? No. Can we agree the report?
Agreed, Chair.
Thank you, Julia. Moving on, item 3B, capital budgeting, capital budget monitoring 2022-2023, housing capital programme, pages 29 to 34. And to take us through the report, Jackie Taylor and Derek Craig. Please take us through the report.
Thank you, Chair. So now we're moving on to our housing capital programme, covering the same period as the last report. So again, this is to the 29th of December 2022. Again, section 4 reminds us that the budget we have for our housing capital programme is £66.4 million. And the same exercise has been carried out to estimate our year-end position, and that's covered at section 4.3. We are estimating that that full budget will spend this year. However, we are noting a risk to that because of the extreme weather that was experienced at the end of last year. As a result, operatives from Property Services have had to deal with those emergency repairs, and therefore there could be an impact on the other capital projects. We'll report back to Forum with an update on that in due course. The spend to the 29th of December is shown at section 4.4, and we're showing that we've spent just over £40.5 million. So very slightly behind where we expect to be at that point in time. If I take you to the appendices, on page 31 we have Appendix A. This shows the summary of the funding that makes up the Housing Capital Programme. And again, as I've explained to Forum before, we have details of the majority of our funding comes from the housing revenue account. So this is the account that collects all of the house rents. That is contributed towards some of the capital programme and also borrowing in order to spend on capital. Physical progress on projects is covered from page 32, and again I'll hand over to Derek. Thanks.
Thank you. Appendix B then, the executive summary for the Housing Capital Programme. I'm pleased to say that at period 10 to the 29th of December, there were no projects in that period, reporting as behind programme. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions on item 3B? No? Can we agree the report?
Agreed, Chair.
Thank you, Julia. Moving on, item number 4, revenue budget monitoring 2022-2023 and probable outturn, pages 35 to 48. And Jackie Taylor will take us through the report, please.
Thanks, Chair. So now we're moving on to our revenue budget. This report is different to the reports that I've brought to you before because it focuses on our probable outturn exercise. So in the same way that we have for capital, we've looked to see what our expected position will be at the end of this year. And it's a deep dive into our commitments for the year. Over on page 36, you can see a summary of what this report does at section 3.2. And what we'll do is we'll report on what we expect our bottom line position to be for the year, and also any transfers to reserves that are being proposed. Any transfers to reserves will take into account commitments that will fall into the new financial year, and they have to be set aside so that we can use them next year. Any transfers to reserves requires approval from committee, and this paper was taken to the Executive Committee, and those approvals have been given. So firstly, in terms of the probable outturn position, section 4 summarises the position that the Council is predicting. Now, there is more information in the appendices around the detail behind these figures, but this report summarises that for you. So firstly, I would draw your attention to Table 1 on page 36. And that shows that our expected position for the year will be £4.696 million of an underspend. And that's detailed over 4 particular areas, and you can see those on that table. And what I'll do is I'll summarise each of those areas for you, and this is detailed in the report. So firstly, resources, and that's covered from section 4.4 onwards. The resource position is the spend that each of our resources will make, so what education make, what social work make, etc. And for all of our resources, we're predicting that we will see a relatively small overspend of £335,000 for the year. Now that includes a break-even position for social work resources. In relation to adults and older people, there is a £1.4 million commitment in relation to the element of the budget that's delegated to the Integrated Joint Board. Now, that commitment reflects one of the recommendations to the report, where we propose that the Integrated Joint Board retains that underspend and can carry it forward in their reserves earmarked for future years' care costs. And that's in line with the approach that we've taken in previous years. There is a further underspend in relation to adults and older people spend of £5.6 million, and that relates to core council funding that was passed over to the IJB. Now, the financial regulations of the IJB allow the council to adjust our contributions in respect of any unplanned underspends like this, and we can reduce our contribution by that amount. So what we've proposed and what's been agreed at the Executive Committee is that we will retain that underspend of £5.6 million, and that will be set aside, and that will help with children and families' budget pressures next year. So still within the social work world, but specifically we'll hold it for children and families. Now, well, that's the position as we're reporting at the moment. We may have to revisit that if there's a change in the financial outlook by the end of the year. So that's the position in relation to resources. In relation to loan charges, so this is the cost that we incur when we repay back debt, there is an in-year underspend of £4.7 million, and that's after we transfer money to reserves, and I'll cover that in a second, the transfers to reserves. So if we take into account the transfers to reserves that have been agreed and are being proposed, we see an underspend in year of £1.18 million, and that's contributing to the overall position for the council. The next section, 4.9, which is still on page 37, is what we call corporate items. Now, this is a catch-all of spend that's made that's not specifically related to any one resource. And what we're reporting is that after our transfers to reserves, we expect the underspend on that corporate items line to be £2.3 million. Now, that mainly is in relation to budget that we'd set aside for expected increases in national insurance contributions, which was reversed, and therefore it wasn't required in year. That's the majority of that underspend. Corporate items 2023-24 strategy is covered at section 4.11. Now, this is a specific line that we set up within our budget to capture previously agreed transfers to reserves in relation to a review of how we make our loans fund payments. So that simply reflects the fact that we'd identified money that was going to be set into reserves for future budgets, and we'll adopt that approach. So that has no impact on our bottom line position. A similar position is reported at section 4.12, and that's about investment monies. You'll recall that over the last couple of years, we've managed to set aside some money for specific investments. In November, the Council agreed to revisit those investments and direct some of that spend towards helping with the cost of living crisis and our warm welcome approach. So that money sits within the budget. We're assuming a break-even position at the moment, and that's anticipated. If there is unspent money from that pot, we'll carry it forward into future years, should we need to. At 4.13, we're talking about council tax and council tax reduction scheme. So there is an underspend reported within that particular budget line, or an over-recovery, should I say, and that is just over £1.5 million. And that mainly reflects the levels of in-year collection from properties, which is a positive position. And again, that contributes towards the overall underspend for the council. So if you remember table 1, those particular items were all detailed to total £4.696 million of an underspend. Table 2 of the report on page 38 presents that information in a slightly different way in terms of it pulls out transfers to reserves into two separate lines, and you can see them at the second last and third last lines on that table. There are proposed transfers to reserves of £17.195 million, and there was previously approved transfers to reserves of £17.4 million. And when we come to the appendices, I can take you through those in a little bit of detail. But when they're taken into account, we're getting back to that underspend for the council of £4.696 million. And what the committee agreed, what the executive committee agreed last week, was that that money would be considered to support next year's budget strategy. And that's reported at 4.16. Section 5 of the report starts to pick up a current year position as at the 29th of December, and we're showing a very small underspend of £92,000. The housing revenue account position is covered at section 6, and we're reporting a break-even position for the housing revenue account. Now, for information, Appendix 1 I mentioned earlier, which starts on page 40, it gives a little bit more information around those areas that make up the council overall underspend, and they're referenced within the overall report. So you can pick out if you have any specific lines of interest that you want to get a little bit more information on. That appendix hopefully will provide that for you. If I take you to Appendix 2, which is on page 44, that is the usual breakdown of the council's budget and spend across resources and individual services. And you can see on the right-hand unshaded side of the table, you can see actual spend in that middle column up to period 10. The shaded area of that table now includes our forecast information. So now that we've carried out that probable outturn exercise, you can see that information recorded there against resources and against services. And that position is before transfers to reserves. And as I mentioned, there's also a position after transfers to reserves as well, which leads me neatly into Appendix 3, where we start to detail those proposed transfers to reserves. So Appendix 3 is the proposals that were made to the Executive Committee on new transfers to reserves. And what these reflect are spend areas where we have commitments into the new financial year, or where we've already identified as part of next year's budget that will set aside money from this year to help manage budget gaps. You can see a couple of familiar figures. So if I take you down to probably just a third of the way down the report, under social work resources, you can see the children and families underspend that I mentioned earlier that we'll retain from the budget that we set aside for the IGB of £5.6 million. The line above that picks up the pupil equity fund funding that education get. So what we're indicating here is that we need to set aside £1.5 million of funds to allow us to spend up to the end of the school term, which finishes in June. That's out of alignment with the financial year end, which is the end of March. So those proposed transfers to reserves, which total £17.2 million on page 45, were agreed by the Executive Committee. And also included in Appendix 4 on page 46 was previously approved transfers to reserves, which are also included in the Council's bottom line position. Appendix 5 simply reports the same level of information for spend and resources after transfers to reserves, for your information. And Appendix 6, which is on page 48, gives the normal presentation of our housing revenue account, and we're showing a break-even position, both in terms of outturn for the year and for the period to the 29th of December. So a fair bit of detail in that report, but happy to take any questions, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions about the report? I'll take questions now. Okay. Can we agree the report? Can we agree the report, please?
Agreed, Chair.
Thank you, Julia. Moving on, item number 5, Revenue Budget Monitoring 2022 to 2023, Detailed Resource Analysis on pages 49 to 118, and Lorraine O'Hagan will take us through the report, please.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. Agenda item 5 then starts on page 49 with the summary report, or the covering report rather, and the substance of the paper starts in Appendix A, which is on page 51. As Jackie has talked you through the higher level report that went to Executive Committee last week, what we look at here is the detail against each resource. And again, the position is shown before and after transfers to reserves. So in terms of the summary statement for Community and Enterprise Resources on page 51, the greyed out box shows the probable outturn position for the resource. The bottom right-hand corner is the substance of it, which shows a 1.277 underspend before transfers. The resource have requested and have approval for 1.270 million of transfers, which you can see in the forecast column. And then bottom line, that remains results rather in an underspend of £7,000 at the end of the year. That's their forecast. What we have on the right-hand side of the table then is the position at accounting period 10, which then shows a 982,000 underspend before transfers, and then a £5,000 underspend after transfers. The substance of the trends then that follow on from this summary statement basically show the position before transfers to reserves across all budget lines. So you have there then, starting on page 52, the narrative explanations for the resource, again with any new variances highlighted for you with an underline or an underscore. And for Community and Enterprise Resources, there are probably about a dozen new variances, and I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any. Thank you.
Are there any questions on this report? No? Please lead us through the next report, Lorraine.
Okay, thank you. So next we have Education Resources, which is on page 69. So again, we can see in the greyed out box, the probable outturn position for education is 1.5 million of an underspend, but after transfers to reserves of £1.5 million, we're showing a break-even position for the resource. At the end of period 10, we're showing a 1.154 underspend, and again, showing the position after transfers is a break-even position. For education, we have probably about half a dozen new variances, and I should say that there's probably more new variances at this point in the year because we've gone through the probable outturn exercise. We know a bit more about how each of the individual lines is going to fare, and that's been presented to you this afternoon. So again, if anyone has any questions on the underlined variances, I'm happy to take them. Thank you.
Are there any questions on this section of the report? No questions? Okay. Thank you. Please lead us through the next report, Lorraine.
Okay, thank you. Finance and Corporate Resources is the next resource, and that's on page 79, again with your summary statement. So again, showing a break-even position for the resource before transfers. Finance and Corporate had no transfers, and therefore we're showing break-even as our forecast for the year. On the right-hand side, again, showing a break-even position for the service with a few ups and downs across services. In terms of variances that are new this period, again, probably about half a dozen or so across the service areas. And again, they're underlined for members' information. And again, happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Are there any questions on this section of the report? No? Okay. Please move on to the next section. Thank you.
The next section then is Housing and Technical Resources, and that's on page 87. The resource before transfers to reserves are showing in the forecast box 342,000 of an overspend. Again, the resource didn't request any transfers, so 342,000 is the position that's included in the report that Jackie took us through earlier. In terms of the period 10 position, we're showing 127,000 of an overspend, and that's a proportion of their overall prediction for the year. And they're showing that position again before and after transfers. In terms of new variances, there's probably about a dozen new variances within the resource over the next few pages. Again, they're underscored for members' information, so again, happy to take any questions if there are any. Thank you.
Are there any questions on this section of the report? No. Okay. Please move on to the next section of the report.
Okay, thank you. Now, Jackie's already taken you through the housing revenue account position, but on page 97, there's a little bit more detail there in terms of the individual variances within that service area. Again, the new variances for members' information are shown with an underscore, so I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. Thank you.
Are there any questions on this section of the report? No? Okay. And please lead us through the next section.
The final section then, or final resource rather, is social work resources, and that's shown on page 105. In the greyed out box, you can see the position before transfers is an underspend of 5.635 million, and the transfer to reserves, as Jackie mentioned earlier, in relation to supporting children and families, is shown there, taking the position to break even rather at the end up. Period 10 is on the right hand side. Again, position before transfers is shown, so that's 3.815 of an underspend, and a transfer to reserves of 3.815, therefore again resulting in a break-even position. For social work, there's quite a number of new variances, again because we've gone through this deep dive as part of the Probable Outtum exercise. Again, they're underscored for members' information, and I can pick up any questions if there are any.
Are there any questions on the last section of the report? Okay. Can we agree all sections and the complete report, please?
Agreed, Chair.
Thank you, Julia. Moving on to the last item of business. Any other items of urgent business? There are none, and I would like to thank you for your attendance today, and I declare the meeting closed. Thank you.
Did you pages?